Picture this. You're a lady-in-waiting in the gilded halls of Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, the year 1566. It's a Saturday evening around 8 p.m, and you're seated at an intimate supper in the Queen's private chamber. Candlelight flickers across the faces of your companions. Queen Mary, heavily pregnant and glowing with maternal anticipation. And beside her, David Riccio, the Italian secretary whose melodious voice and charming conversation have made him the Queen's most trusted confidant. The scent of roasted meat and wine fills the air. You're laughing at something Riccio just said when suddenly the door bursts open. You turn, expecting a servant, but instead you see Lord Darnley, the Queen's husband, his face twisted with rage. Behind him, armed men, dozens of them, and you realize in that stomach-dropping moment that someone is about to die tonight. What you're about to witness, what historians would later call one of the most brutal murders in royal history, represents only the beginning of Mary Queen of Scots' descent into a nightmare from which she would never escape. And the truth they never tell you is this: Mary wasn't just a queen who lost her throne. She was a woman systematically destroyed by the men around her, trapped in a web of violence, conspiracy, and betrayal so twisted that even today, over 4 centuries later, we're still trying to untangle the truth from the lies. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Mary Queen of Scots, you must first understand that she was doomed from birth. Born in December 1542 at Falkland Palace, Mary arrived into a kingdom in chaos. Her father, King James V, had just been humiliated in battle against the English. When they told him his wife had delivered a daughter instead of the desperately needed son, he reportedly turned his face to the wall and uttered words that would haunt Scottish history. It came with a lass, and it will pass with a lass. 6 days later, he was dead. Mary became Queen of Scotland at 6 days old, but she would never truly be Scottish. Here's what makes her story so devastating. Mary was immediately turned into a political pawn. At age 5 years old, she was shipped across the sea to France to marry the French Dauphin. Imagine being torn from your mother as a kindergartner and sent to a foreign country where you'd spend the next 13 years. She grew up French, spoke French, thought French. She was surrounded by the 4 Marys, 4 Scottish ladies-in-waiting, all coincidentally named Mary, who became her only connection to the homeland she barely remembered. Scotland was just an abstract concept, a crown she wore in name only while dancing in French palaces and learning courtly etiquette from the most sophisticated monarchy in Europe. Then fate dealt its first crushing blow. In 1560, Mary's husband Francis died suddenly. He was only 16 years old. Queen of France at 17, widow at 19. But wait, it gets worse. In the same year, her mother died too. Mary found herself utterly alone, a French widow with no place at the French court, no family, no protection. The French made it clear she was no longer wanted. She had 2 choices: obscurity or return to Scotland, a country she hadn't seen since she was 5, where she didn't know the nobles, didn't understand the politics, and spoke with a French accent that would mark her as a foreigner forever. She chose Scotland, and that choice would destroy her. Picture Mary stepping off the ship in August 1561. She's 19, tall, nearly 6 feet, towering over most men, elegant, sophisticated, Catholic. She arrives expecting to be welcomed as queen. Instead, she walks into a Protestant revolution. While she'd been in France, Scotland had undergone the Reformation. The Scotland she remembered from childhood was Catholic. The Scotland she returned to was violently, aggressively Protestant. And Protestant Scotland looked at this French-speaking Catholic queen and saw an enemy. John Knox, The Protestant preacher who had become Scotland's spiritual dictator immediately began denouncing her from pulpits across Edinburgh. One mass, he declared, was more dangerous than 10,000 armed enemies. When Mary tried to attend Catholic Mass in the Chapel Royal, in her own palace, mobs gathered outside threatening violence. Nobles who had been managing Scotland in her absence had no intention of letting this foreign woman actually rule. She was surrounded by men who smiled to her face while plotting to control her, manipulate her, or destroy her. And then Mary made her first catastrophic mistake. She fell in love. In July 1565, Mary met Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was 22, handsome, charming, and crucially, he was Catholic and had a claim to the English throne through his mother. For the first time since returning to Scotland, Mary felt less alone. Here was someone who understood her faith, her position, her isolation. They married quickly, too quickly. Within months, Mary realized what she'd done. Darnley wasn't a supportive husband. He was a jealous, insecure, violent alcoholic who resented that Mary held more power than him. He wanted to be king in his own right, not just the Queen's husband. But what nobody tells you about Darnley is how truly dangerous he was. He began drinking heavily, publicly humiliating Mary with mistresses and demanding more political power. Worse, he became obsessed with David Riccio, Mary's Italian secretary. Riccio was talented, intelligent, and Mary trusted him completely. She spent hours with him discussing politics, music, correspondence, and Darnley, paranoid and drunk, became convinced that Riccio was Mary's lover. Rumours spread through the Scottish court like poison. Was Mary's baby? She was 6 months pregnant, even Darnley's child, or was it Riccio's bastard? Now we return to that Saturday evening, March 9th, 1566. You're sitting at supper with Mary and Riccio when Darnley and 80 armed conspirators storm the chamber. What happens next is so brutal that Mary would describe it as the moment her soul broke. Darnley grabs his pregnant wife, holding her back while she screams. Lord Ruthven, wearing full armour, draws his dagger and demands Riccio be handed over. Riccio, terrified, hides behind Mary, clutching at her skirts. Mary tries to protect him, but someone points a pistol at her swollen belly. The conspirators drag Riccio from behind Mary. He's screaming, begging for mercy, crying out to the Queen to save him. They haul him into the outer chamber and begin stabbing him. Again, and again, and again. 57 times they stab him. 57 dagger wounds. The final blow is delivered with Darnley's own dagger, though Darnley himself was too cowardly to wield it. Riccio's blood pools on the palace floor just outside Mary's chambers. His screams echo through Holyrood. And Mary, 6 months pregnant, held at gunpoint, can do nothing but watch. When they're finished, when Riccio's mutilated corpse lies cooling in a puddle of blood, Darnley comes to Mary and accuses her. "You cuckolded me," he says. "You betrayed me with that Italian. The baby isn't mine." Mary stares at her husband, this man she thought she loved, and understands with perfect clarity, "I am married to a murderer. I am trapped, and if I don't escape, I will be next." Here's where Mary reveals her intelligence. Despite being in shock, despite being heavily pregnant, despite being under armed guard, Mary begins planning. She uses the one weapon she has left, her body. She sends word to Darnley that she wants to see him alone. She tells him she forgives him. She tells him she understands he was manipulated by the other nobles. She tells him she still loves him. And Darnley, vain, stupid, desperate to believe he's the hero of this story, falls for it. Mary beguiled him with soothing words, as one contemporary account put it. She offers to make love to him. She plays the submissive wife, and while Darnley thinks he's won her back, Mary is arranging her escape. Within days, Mary flees Holyrood Palace with loyalists and reaches safety. She publicly reconciles with Darnley, but privately, she now hates him with an intensity that frightens her attendants. She writes to supporters, "I cannot look upon his face without remembering that blood. He is a coward and a murderer, and I am trapped in marriage to him as surely as if he had locked me in a tower. 3 months later, in June 1566, Mary gives birth to her son James. She forces Darnley to publicly acknowledge the child as his, destroying the rumours about Riccio. And then Darnley becomes, in Mary's mind, expendable. She has her heir. She has secured the succession. And she has a husband who murdered her friend in front of her, who threatened her life, who might kill her at any moment. What would you do? On February 10th, 1567, just 8 months after James's birth, something happens that remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Darnley is staying at a house called Kirker Field in Edinburgh, supposedly recovering from illness. At 2 a.m, the house explodes. The blast is so powerful it wakes half of Edinburgh. People rush to the scene expecting to find Darnley's body in the rubble, but here's the thing that makes no sense. Darnley's body is found outside the house, in the garden, apparently unburned. He and his servant are both dead, but not from the explosion. They appear to have been strangled after escaping the blast. Someone set a trap. Someone planted explosives to kill Darnley. But when he escaped the explosion, someone was waiting outside to finish the job. The question that would haunt Mary for the rest of her life. Did she know? The prime suspect was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful Scottish nobleman who had been close to Mary for years. Within days, placards appeared all over Edinburgh showing Mary and Bothwell together, accusing them of murder and adultery. Mary's reputation, already damaged by the Riccio affair, now collapsed completely. Whether she was involved or whether she was being framed remains debatable even today. But what happened next made her look absolutely, undeniably guilty. On April 21st, 1567, just 10 weeks after Darnley's murder, Mary left Edinburgh to visit her infant son James. She'd see him for the last time in her life, though she didn't know it yet. On the return journey, Bothwell appeared with 800 armed men. He told Mary there was danger in Edinburgh, and that for her safety, he needed to take her to Dunbar Castle. Mary believed him. She sent a messenger ahead to warn Edinburgh. But when the messenger arrived in the capital, there was no danger, no threat, no emergency. By then, Mary was locked inside Dunbar Castle with Bothwell, and what happened next is one of the most controversial episodes in her entire story. According to Mary's own later testimony, Bothwell raped her inside Dunbar Castle. Whether this was genuine rape, or whether Mary claimed rape to excuse what she was about to do, is something historians still argue about. What we know for certain is this: Bothwell rapidly divorced his wife. And on May 15th, 1567, just 3 months after Darnley's murder, Mary married Bothwell, the man accused of murdering her husband, the man who had either abducted and raped her, or who she had conspired with all along. The Scottish nobles exploded with rage. Catholic and Protestant lords united for once in their fury. This was too much, even for Renaissance standards. This was scandalous beyond belief. Within weeks, they raised an army and marched against Mary and Bothwell. According to the French ambassador, Mary herself seemed to realize what she'd done. She was heard screaming for a knife to kill herself. She seemed, the ambassador wrote, to fall entirely into despair. Whether she had genuinely been manipulated and assaulted by Bothwell, or whether she had made a catastrophic political miscalculation, the result was the same. She had lost Scotland. On June 15, 1567, Mary surrendered at Carberry Hill. Bothwell was allowed to flee into exile. He would never face justice for anything he'd done. But Mary was imprisoned on the island of Lochleven, locked in a castle surrounded by water with no escape. She was 24 years old. She had been Queen of Scotland for less than 6 years. And on July 24, 1567, while imprisoned and under enormous psychological pressure, Mary was forced to abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son. The baby she'd held just weeks earlier was now King James VI. Mary was nobody. But this wasn't the end of her nightmare. This was only the beginning. For the next 11 months, Mary was held prisoner on Lochleven, isolated and desperate. Then, in May 1568, she did something extraordinary. She escaped. With help from sympathetic guards, who were charmed by her or believed in her innocence, Mary fled the island and gathered an army of loyalists who still believed she was the rightful queen. For one brief shining moment, it seemed possible that she might reclaim her throne. She fought a battle at Langside against the rebel lords. She lost. Utterly. Her forces were scattered, her hopes destroyed. And in that moment of desperation, Mary made the single worst decision of her life. She fled across the border into England and begged her cousin Elizabeth for help. Elizabeth the Fyes, Protestant Queen of England, childless, paranoid, and deeply threatened by Mary's claim to her throne, welcomed Mary with apparent warmth. And then Elizabeth locked her up. For 19 years. 19 years, Mary was held prisoner in English castles. She would never see her son again. She would never return to Scotland. She would never touch freedom again. Elizabeth couldn't execute Mary without cause. She was a crowned queen, and killing her would set a dangerous precedent. But neither could Elizabeth let her go. Mary's very existence was a threat. Every Catholic in England looked at Mary as the true queen. Every foreign power that opposed Elizabeth saw Mary as a weapon. So Mary lived in a peculiar hell. She was treated as a guest, but held as a prisoner. She was moved from castle to castle, Carlisle, Tutbury, Sheffield, Fotheringhay, always cold, always watched, always isolated. At Tutbury, the castle was so damp and draughty that Mary developed crippling rheumatism that would plague her for decades. She was allowed to keep her dogs. She loved dogs, especially little terriers and Maltese spaniels, and they became her only companions beyond her few remaining loyal servants. According to her attendants, Mary would spend hours with her dogs, speaking to them as if they were her only friends in the world. And Mary plotted. For 19 years, she wrote thousands of letters smuggled out through hidden networks. She conspired with Catholic priests, Spanish diplomats, the Pope himself. She became the center of every Catholic plot against Elizabeth. She couldn't help herself. She had been raised to believe she was meant to rule. She couldn't simply accept imprisonment and despair. But every plot was discovered. Every conspiracy was exposed. Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, was watching Mary's every move, intercepting her letters, documenting her conspiracies. Then came the trap that would kill her. In 1586, a Catholic named Anthony Babington organized a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and crown Mary. Walsingham's spies had infiltrated the conspiracy from the beginning. They let it develop. They encouraged it. And when Mary wrote letters supporting the plot, the infamous casket letters that historians still debate today, Walsingham had his proof. Whether Mary genuinely intended to participate, or whether the letters were forged or manipulated by Walsingham's agents, is still contested. But it didn't matter. Elizabeth had the excuse she needed. In October 1586, Mary was put on trial for treason. She was 53 years old. Her once famous beauty faded by nearly 2 decades of captivity. She defended herself brilliantly, arguing that she was a sovereign queen who couldn't be tried by subjects, that she'd been imprisoned and had a right to seek freedom. It didn't matter. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty. Sentence. Death. Elizabeth hesitated for months, signing and withdrawing the death warrant repeatedly. Finally, on February 7, 1587, Mary was told she would be executed the next morning. She spent her final night writing farewell letters to her son James, whom she hadn't seen in 20 years, to her supporters, to her attendants. She prayed. She prepared her soul. According to witnesses, she seemed almost relieved. After 19 years of imprisonment, death would be a mercy. On the morning of February 8, 1587, Mary walked to the scaffold in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. She wore black, but underneath, she wore a crimson petticoat, red, the colour of Catholic martyrs. As she approached the block, something moved in her skirts. Her little terrier, her beloved dog, had hidden in the folds of her dress and followed her to execution. The executioner was shaking. He asked forgiveness. Mary smiled, actually smiled, and said simply, "Into your hands, O Lord. I commit my spirit." She placed her head on the block. The axe fell. But here's the detail they don't tell you. It took multiple blows. The executioner was so nervous that he missed. When he finally lifted what he thought was Mary's severed head to proclaim, "God save Queen Elizabeth," he found himself holding only a wig. Mary's real head, with the lips still moving in prayer, had fallen to the floor. And then her dress moved. The little terrier emerged from the folds of her crimson petticoat, trembling and soaked in her blood. The dog lay down between Mary's severed head and her body and refused to move. It had to be carried away by force. Everything that had touched Mary's blood, the block, her clothes, her possessions, was burned immediately. Elizabeth's government was terrified Mary would become a martyr. They were right to fear it. Here's the final, bitter irony that makes Mary's story almost unbearable. In 1603, just 16 years after Mary's execution, Elizabeth died childless. And who inherited the English throne? James VI of Scotland, Mary's son. The boy she'd held for just a few months, the child she'd been forced to abandon, the son who grew up never knowing his mother. He became James the Foreign of England, uniting the Scottish and English crowns exactly as Mary had always dreamed. Everything Mary had fought for, everything she'd lost, everything she died for, her son inherited it all. If she'd just survived 16 more years, if she'd just outlived Elizabeth, she would have seen her son become king of both Scotland and England. She died for nothing. Mary Queen of Scots spent the last 19 years of her life, nearly half her adult life, locked in stone rooms, watching through windows as the world moved on without her. She went from being Queen of France to Queen of Scotland to prisoner to corpse. She was manipulated, betrayed, possibly raped, definitely framed, and ultimately executed. Behind every historical narrative of royal intrigue, there are real human beings who suffered. Behind Mary's story are thousands of nights alone, thousands of unanswered letters, a son she never knew, a throne she held for 6 months, and a little dog soaked in her blood who refused to leave her side even in death. She reminds us that power destroys, that ambition without allies is suicide, and that being a woman with a crown in the 16th century was perhaps the most dangerous thing anyone could be. Mary Queen of Scots was brilliant, beautiful, and broken by forces she could never fully control. She ruled kingdoms and died on a scaffold. But in her final moment, speaking her last prayer as the axe descended, she ruled the only thing that truly mattered: her own soul, her own dignity, her own story. And that story echoes across 4 centuries, a warning, a tragedy, and a testament to the price of power. A woman caught between thrones, ultimately destroyed by them, yet remembered long after her executioners turned to dust. That is the legacy of Mary Queen of Scots, not a crown, not a kingdom, but the eternal echo of her suffering, her defiance, and her tragic grace in the face of an impossible fate.